In 1969, a young soldier disappeared from a quiet fishing spot on the edge of a lagoon in Brazil. He was trained, disciplined, and used to danger. But nothing in his military life could have prepared him for what came next. Days later, he turned up again -225 miles away from where he had vanished. He was sunburnt, limping, unshaven, and carrying only the same simple knapsack he had taken with him. To his commanders, his condition looked like exhaustion. To him, it was proof of something far stranger. The kidnappers, he said, weren't human. They wore metallic suits, they carried strange weapons, and they dragged him into a machine that was nothing like anything on Earth. He claims he saw other men, lifeless, laid out on stone slabs, and he swore that these beings demanded something terrifying: human weapons. But his testimony doesn't end there. At the height of his fear, he also described an encounter with something holy, a vision so powerful that it gave him the strength to refuse his captors. This is not just the story of one man's strange disappearance. It's a file that raises more questions than it answers. Could this be one of the most overlooked military abduction cases of the Cold War? Or was it something else entirely, an ancient ritual hidden in modern clothing? Stay with us as we trace his missing days on the map, test the distances, and compare two very different explanations: alien, abduction, or shamanic rite. By the end, you'll decide what can be verified and what can't. Our story begins in early May of 1969 in southeastern Brazil. The man at the center of it all was José Antônio da Silva, a 24-year-old conscript serving in the Brazilian military police. By those who knew him, José was described as quiet, disciplined, and reliable. He lived the routine of a soldier, but on weekends he had a habit that gave him peace: packing a simple cloth knapsack, grabbing his fishing gear, and escaping to the countryside. On Saturday evening, May 3rd, he left home and boarded a local bus bound for the rural district of Mario Campos. His destination was a small lagoon known as Bebedouro, a place he had visited many times before. It wasn't completely remote, but it was quiet, surrounded by forest, and perfect for fishing alone. By the time José arrived, it was already close to midnight. He hadn't come just for a short trip. His plan was to stay overnight and spend all of Sunday by the water. With only his knapsack and fishing equipment, he made a crude tent, settled down, and slept by the lagoon's edge. Here's where we pause for clarity. Everything from this point on comes directly from José's testimony, given in later interviews and repeated in UFO research reports. This is testimony, not physical proof. Names, dates, and locations match period sources, but the experiences described are his own words. Our role is to reconstruct them as faithfully as possible, while leaving space for the unanswered questions. When José awoke the next morning, Sunday, May 4th, the lagoon was calm. He spent the day fishing, resting, and enjoying the solitude. Friends would later confirm this was typical. José often preferred fishing alone, carrying only basic items: hooks, line, a knife, a little food, a spare shirt, and a rosary tied to his shorts. Nothing about that quiet Sunday suggested it would end in one of Brazil's strangest military case files. The sun climbed higher. Hours passed uneventfully. Then, sometime after noon, José began noticing movement. At first, it was faint, shadows shifting between the trees, whispers that could have been nothing more than the wind. He tried to ignore it, but by mid-afternoon, the feeling was unmistakable. There were figures in the forest, and they were not just passing by. They were watching him. By mid-afternoon, the calm of the lagoon had shifted. José's line trailed in the water, but his eyes kept flicking to the forest behind him. Between the trunks, shapes seemed to move, quick, uncertain, almost like shadows breaking loose from the trees. At first, he brushed it off. He had spent plenty of time alone outdoors. Tricks of light were nothing new. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. A murmur carried across the water, low voices that made the hairs on his neck rise. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, perhaps travelers on the path beyond the trees. He was about to call out when a strange sound rippled through the forest. A groan, long, metallic, and unlike anything he had ever heard. Pain followed in an instant. It tore through the back of his legs, sharp and consuming, like fire and cramp at the same time. His rod slipped from his hand, and he collapsed to his knees, gasping. He clawed at his calves, expecting to find skin blistering or burned. But his legs were untouched, only bathed in a strange glow. The light was a beam. Red around the edges, green at the core, locked on his bare skin. It crawled across him like a spotlight, yet it left no mark. The agony, however, was real. His muscles seized so violently he couldn't stand. Then hands grabbed him, strong, unyielding, hooking under his arms and dragging him back from the water's edge. His legs scraped across dirt and roots as he struggled, helpless against the grip. He twisted, trying to look. Two figures, shorter than him, but solid. Their bodies were covered in metallic suits that caught the sun in sharp glints. Helmets enclosed their heads, round at the back, square at the front, with two dark holes where eyes should have been. Thin tubes snaked down from their masks into packs strapped across their backs. Joe's heart raced. Bandits? Guerrillas? No, their movements were too smooth, their shapes too strange. He tried to fight, but his body refused him. The memory of the burning in his legs haunted every thought. If they could do that to him with ease, what would they do next? The lagoon slipped out of sight as the figures pulled him deeper into the forest. His heels left streaks in the soil. Every breath came harsh and quick. The sound of boots on dry leaves mixed with the rasp of his own panic. Ahead, another figure waited in the middle of a narrow dirt road. Joe recognized it immediately as the one who had struck him down. Behind it stood something far more terrifying. Rising from the ground was a gray cylinder, topped and bottomed with black discs. Its sides gleamed dully, and from one, a doorway stood open, just large enough for a man to walk through. Joe's body stiffened. Whatever this was, it wasn't a truck. It wasn't anything human. Joe's body stiffened. Whatever this was, it wasn't a truck. It wasn't anything human. The figures yanked him forward and into the opening carved into the side of the cylinder. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the forest vanished behind a flood of white light. It had no source, no lamp or flame. The glow came from everywhere at once, bleeding out of the walls and cutting sharp into his eyes. Blinking through the sting, Joe saw the chamber. It was small, no larger than a room in a house. The walls curved inward, smooth and metallic, and in the center stood a single chair surrounded by three more along the edges. Each surface gleamed like polished stone. The beings dragged him to one of the side seats and pushed him down with quick, efficient movements. Before he could react, one leaned over him. Joe caught a glimpse of something heavy in its hands before the object was forced over his head. A helmet. Its edges dug into his shoulders and pressed hard into the back of his neck. His vision narrowed to two small circles, and the weight made it difficult to lift his head. The air inside was thin, stale, each breath shallow and unsatisfying. Panic spread in his chest. He clawed at the sides, but his strength was gone. Then the floor began to vibrate. A low hum rose through the seat, through his body, rattling in his bones. The sound thickened until it seemed to swallow the chamber. Joe realized with horror what was happening. They were lifting. The cylinder was no longer resting on the earth. The pressure pressed him into the seat. His chest burned with the effort of breathing through the mask. Around him, the beings exchanged words, low, guttural, almost playful in their rhythm. He couldn't understand, but the tone chilled him. It sounded as if they were enjoying themselves. The higher they went, the worse it became. Cold seeped into his bare skin. His calves throbbed with the memory of the beam, fire, and numbness locked together. Every nerve seemed alive with pain. His blood burned. He clutched the seat so hard his nails cut into his palms. The hum deepened. His body felt heavier with each passing moment, as if gravity itself was doubling, tripling, pinning him in place. His lungs strained against the mask, dragging in air that never felt enough. The edges of his vision blurred. Fear clawed at his mind, mixing with exhaustion, until thought itself slipped away. Minutes felt like hours. The vibration never ceased, a constant pulse that grew louder until it was all he could hear. His heart hammered. His body shook. His breath rasped. Then, without warning, the motion changed. The chamber tilted, not forward or back, but sideways, as though the entire craft had rolled onto its edge. Jose's stomach lurched violently. He braced himself against the seat, yet somehow it adapted with the movement, holding him steady even as the room leaned. A sharp jolt ran through the walls. And then, silence. For a moment, there was nothing. The hum stopped. The craft stood still. Jose's body sagged against the hard seat, every muscle trembling. Then rough hands grabbed him again. He was lifted to his feet, his helmet still locked tight around his head. Darkness pressed against him as something was fastened across the eye holes, sealing away even the narrow view he had left. He stumbled forward as they dragged him, blind and terrified. His legs dragged like dead weight, scraping across the floor. Around him, voices echoed, more now than before, deeper, sharper, carrying a tone of command. He had no idea how many were there. He could only hear them, a chorus of guttural sounds rising and falling. Time blurred. He was guided through passages he couldn't see, pulled this way, and that, until at last they stopped. The covering was ripped from his helmet. Light stabbed into his eyes, and when his vision cleared, Joe's froze. He was standing in the middle of an immense stone chamber. The walls stretched high above him, their surfaces rough and ancient, lit by an unseen glow. The space was square, bare of doors or windows, silent, except for the sounds of his captors. It felt more like a temple than a room on any craft. Then his gaze locked on the figure before him. Shorter than a man, broad in the chest, its body covered in thick reddish hair that cascaded down into a long beard. The skin that showed was pale, the face disturbing. Enormous eyebrows stretched nearly from temple to temple, framing eyes too large for the head, their pupils glowing green like leaves in summer. The sclera was not white, but a darker shade, unnatural and heavy. The mouth hung wide, lipless, toothless, more like the gape of a fish. And through it all, the being never blinked. Joes shuddered. He didn't need to be told. This was the leader. Around the edges of the room, shadows moved. One after another, more of the same beings came into focus. A dozen, maybe more. They lingered just outside his clear vision, their chatter sharp and excited, their attention fixed on him. Then his three original captors stepped forward. With a hiss of release, they pulled off their helmets. Jose's stomach turned as the same hair-covered faces stared back at him, confirming that they weren't masks at all. He wanted to look away, to shut his eyes, but something else caught his attention. Against the far wall, on a raised stone slab, lay 4 human bodies. All men, all from different backgrounds, their features unmistakably varied. Different races, different builds, but united in stillness. Their skin was pale, rigid, lifeless. Their eyes were shut, their chests unmoving. Jose's breath hitched. He thought of himself lying there next. He fought the urge to panic. forcing his gaze to move elsewhere, and that was when he noticed the wall beside the slab, covered in pictures. Ordinary things, as though pulled from a child's book. Jaguars and giraffes, forests, towns, oceans, even drawings of cars and airplanes. Familiar, almost comforting, but entirely out of place in this stone chamber. Why would these creatures have such images? What were they trying to say? The chatter around him swelled. The leader remained fixed in front of him, those leaf-green eyes unblinking. Jose's thoughts spun. He wanted to believe the bodies were not real, that this was some trick of the light. But deep down, he knew what he was looking at. We should pause here. Claims of human remains are impossible to verify. No evidence outside of Jose's testimony was ever recovered. We repeat this detail because he swore it was true, but we cannot confirm it. Still, for Jose in that moment, the sight was real enough. His legs nearly gave out beneath him. The chamber seemed to close in, the air thick with heat and noise. He clutched at his bare arms, willing himself to stay upright. And then, as though his fear wasn't enough, the beings changed their focus. One of them stepped forward carrying something familiar, something that made Jose's heart twist with shock. It was his knapsack. They had brought it with them. And when they opened it, the first thing they pulled free was his military identification. The leader took the card between his hands and turned it over slowly, as though studying every mark on it. Then he passed it to the others. One by one they examined it, their large green eyes fixed on the tiny photograph, the stamped lettering, the seal of the military police. Their chatter grew louder, almost excited. Jose felt his stomach twist. They understood it meant something. They knew what he was. Then one of them stepped forward holding a device that gleamed faintly in the chamber light. Without warning, it raised the object and aimed it at the wall. A pulse shot out, a beam, identical to the one that had crippled his legs. When it struck stone, the surface glowed briefly, leaving a smear of strange color before fading to dull gray again. Jose flinched. He recognized it immediately. The same weapon, the same pain it had already caused him. The leader shifted, gesturing for another object. A low white slab rose from the floor, smooth and clean like chalkboard stone. In its hand appeared a thin rod, and with swift, deliberate strokes, it began to draw. Jose leaned forward despite himself. He saw a circle etched onto the surface, surrounded by smaller shapes. With a shudder, he realized they were figures, crude stick forms, each holding something shaped like a rifle. A camp, soldiers, weapons. The leader pointed at the sketch, then at the wall, then down to the floor beneath their feet. Finally, it jabbed its finger toward Jose. The meaning chilled him. They wanted weapons. They wanted him to give them the tools of war. Jose shook his head firmly. No. The leader repeated the gesture, stabbing at the drawing again, then lifting its hand upward, pointing toward the unseen sky. Its guttural voice rose, insistent, demanding. Jose swallowed hard and shook his head again. No, he said louder, his voice cracking inside the helmet. The refusal made the chamber tense. The chatter hushed, all eyes locked on him. The leader stood still, the writing tool frozen in its hand. For a long moment, Jose feared what might come next. Then slowly, the being began to draw again. This time, two circles side by side. One filled dark, one left empty. The leader tapped the first, then the second. Day and night, a cycle of time. More circles followed. 3, 10, dozens. The being pointed to the line of circles, then to Jose, then once more to the floor beneath them. It drew again, this time, adding more. Hundreds, almost too many to count. The gesture was clear. Time, years perhaps. Jose stared, trying to make sense of it. In his mind, the pieces formed into something like a bargain. 3 years here on Earth, serving them. Then 7 years with them, wherever they came from. After that, he would return as their guide, bringing them into the human world. The realization struck him cold. He was being offered a deal. Not just weapons, not just cooperation. A contract, binding him to them for a decade. His heart hammered. His mind screamed. The images of the pale bodies on the stone slab came rushing back. The guttural voices pressed in on him. He felt trapped, cornered, forced to answer. He lifted his chin as much as the helmet allowed and shook his head again. Firm, certain, no. The response rippled through the chamber. The chatter turned sharp, almost angry. The leader's hand trembled slightly over the slab. Its eyes glowed in the white light, unblinking, fixed on Joe's with a heat that felt heavier than the air. We should pause here. Communication built only on drawings and gestures leaves room for wide interpretation. What Joe's understood as a demand for weapons and a decade-long agreement may have been something else entirely. Yet in his testimony, this was his conclusion, and it is how he retold it for the rest of his life. We note the risk of misinterpretation, but we preserve the account as he gave it. Still, there is another detail worth observing. Stories from this era, the late 1960s and early 70s, are scattered with similar claims. Non-human beings asking for human technology, specifically weapons. Whether coincidence or cultural echo, this motif appears in several narratives of the Cold War period. Joe's account fits within that wider pattern. Back in the chamber, the refusal hung heavy in the air. The leader lowered the writing tool, its expression unreadable behind the curtain of hair and the green flare of its eyes. The chatter around the walls simmered, but did not fade. The tension built in silence. Then the leader moved suddenly. Its thick fingers stretched forward, swift and harsh, and closed around the chain at Joe's waist. It yanked. The rosary slipped free. Beads spilled to the stone floor. Joe's breath caught. The beads scattered across the stone. The leader held the crucifix up, turning it between thick fingers, then passed it to the others. Each studied it in silence, eyes bright, heads tilting like curious animals. Joe lowered his head and whispered a prayer. At first, it was just breath against the mask, but the words grew firmer. He shut his eyes and focused on the rhythm, steady, unbroken. For the first time since his capture, fear loosened its grip. One of the beings approached holding a small stone cup. The latches on his helmet clicked. Air rushed in, cool against his skin. The leader gestured toward the drink. Joe hesitated, then saw another lift an identical cup and swallow. He raised it to his lips. The liquid was bitter, sharp as crushed leaves. Warmth spread through his chest. The pain in his legs eased. His breathing steadied. Then everything shifted. Joe lifted his head and saw a man standing before him. Average height, lean, barefoot on the stone. A dark robe hung to his ankles, tied with a white cord. His face was calm, his eyes steady, his presence unmistakably human, and yet more than human. Peace filled the space where terror had been. For a moment, the chamber and its strange inhabitants fell away. The vision vanished as quickly as it came. Joe opened his eyes to the leader, still watching him, the crucifix now in another's hand. He spoke through the mask, voice even. It was not Jesus, but he is known to many. We should pause here. Visions like this are not unique. Across cultures, people under extreme stress often describe seeing guides, saints, or holy figures. It does not prove or disprove what happened. It shows how Joe experienced it. The chamber stirred with noise. The beings spoke in fast, guttural bursts, their tones sharp, overlapping. The leader raised a hand, but the chatter did not fade completely. Two of his captors stepped close again, gripping his arms. Another touched the helmet at his head. The crucifix was pressed flat into a hairy palm as though claimed. The argument grew louder, voices bouncing off the stone walls. Jose kept his eyes on the leader. The green pupils burned against him, unblinking. Then the chamber fell still. A choice had been made. Hands gripped his arms again. The helmet was sealed back over his head. The narrow eye holes darkened. Jose felt himself lifted and pulled, blind once more. Voices barked commands around him, urgent and fast. He stumbled as they guided him through unseen passages, then shoved him forward into the cylinder. The seat pressed against his back. The same low hum filled the chamber, and the ascent began in reverse. Tilt, vibration, the roar in his chest. It all came again, as if the first journey had simply rewound. Then nothing. When his senses returned, he was lying on the ground. Cold stone pressed against his shoulder. He blinked against the dim light of dawn and realized he was outside. The cylinder was gone. The figures were gone. The forest was gone. He pushed himself upright and looked around. No lagoon, no fishing spot. Instead, he was surrounded by jagged cliffs, the walls of an abandoned quarry. Strange, unfamiliar. He had no idea where he was. His throat ached with thirst. It felt as if he hadn't had water in days. Nearby, he heard the trickle of a stream. He crawled toward it, cupped water in his hands, and drank until his chest hurt. Still unsatisfied, he filled his flask and drained it again. The need was endless. Hunger followed next. With shaking hands, he set a line in the stream and caught a fish, cooking it over a fire of dry twigs. Only then, with food and water in his stomach, did his body stop shaking. But his relief faded fast. He had no bearings, no clue how far from home he was. His legs still ached, dragging behind him with a limp. He forced himself forward, stumbling across uneven ground until he reached a paved road. Hours passed before he saw a town on the horizon. When he staggered into its streets, the first question he asked was where he was. The answer stunned him. He wasn't near his home city anymore. He was in Espiritu Santo, over 200 miles from where he had vanished. Then came the second shock. He asked what day it was. He had gone fishing on a Sunday. The reply came back clear. It was Thursday. Nearly 5 full days had passed. Exhaustion nearly knocked him down, but he forced himself onward. He made his way to a train station, hoping for help. Instead, suspicion followed him. His clothes were torn. His body was thin, burned, and bruised. He carried no identification, his military card still in the hands of the beings. Officials questioned him, doubting his story. They pressed for proof. Only when word was sent to his unit was his identity finally confirmed. He was allowed to return to his barracks. Doctors noted his limp, the strange weakness in his legs, and the sunburn across his skin. His family later said he looked thinner, older, as though weeks had passed, not days. We pause here. A simple map tells us he was found roughly 225 miles from his fishing spot. By road, it would take many hours of travel. A man on foot, exhausted and half-starved, could not have made that journey in the time he was missing. Was he transported by people? Was he carried? Or was something else at work? What we can test matches only part of his claim. The rest remains unexplained. Jose never forgot the quarry, the stream, or the strange hunger that drove him to eat and drink until he ate. But it was the distance, the days stolen from him, the miles unaccounted for, that haunted him most. So what holds up, and what doesn't? Jose's story leaves us with questions, but some parts we can measure, others, not at all. First, the distance. He vanished near a lagoon outside Belo Horizonte, in Minas Gerais. He reappeared days later in Espiritu Santo, near Vitoria. By road, that is roughly 225 miles. In 1969, A bus journey that far would have taken at least 8 or 9 hours, depending on roads and transfers. On foot, through forest and countryside, the same distance would take weeks, not days, especially for a man weakened by hunger and injury. That makes his sudden reappearance exactly where it was hardest to explain. Second, the missing time. He went fishing on a Sunday. He was found again on a Thursday. 4.5 days gone. Could he have wandered? Possibly, but the details make it less likely. Witnesses described him as exhausted, thin, sunburnt, and limping. But they also noted that he had survived. He had water, he had eaten, and he had made it to a town. That suggests he was conscious, mobile, and trying to return. The problem is, a man in his state would not have covered 225 miles in 4 days. Even with transport, he had no money, no ID, and no reason to travel that exact route. Next, the injuries. Joe's reported severe cramps in his calves, numbness that lingered, and difficulty walking. Doctors noted his limp when he returned to his unit. He also showed signs of dehydration, weight loss, and sunburn. All of these fit scenarios we can explain. Exposure to heat and cold long periods without water, even sudden changes in altitude or pressure. Pilots in training have reported similar burning sensations in their muscles when put under stress. Fear alone can magnify such pain. In this way, at least, his symptoms are not impossible to account for. Another detail, the missing identification card. Joe's ID was never recovered. Authorities confirmed he had left without it and arrived back at the station without it. To some, this may seem small, but it is consistent with his testimony. He claimed the beings took it and studied it, linking him to the military. When he returned home without it, he had no way to prove who he was. That created suspicion at the train station until his superiors confirmed his identity. On this point, the record matches his words. So what does this leave us with? Some parts of Joe's account align with real-world possibilities. His thirst, his weight loss, his limp. These are consistent with days of exposure. His sense of lost time could come from fatigue, trauma, or disorientation. The burning in his calves could have been physical stress or even psychosomatic, but the rest is harder to set aside. The 225 miles in 4.5 days. The unexplained location change. The loss of identification, never found. These remain odd, no matter how we weigh them. Joe's gave his testimony repeatedly, never backing away from what he claimed. Whether he was abducted by beings from another world or swept into something stranger but more human is still open. What can be tested shows both the limits of his body and the mystery of his journey. Some parts are possible without aliens. Others refuse to fit. Joe's story has endured because it sits on a line between two worlds. Read one way, it is an abduction case, a soldier taken, studied, and returned. Read another, it resembles an ancient pattern. The ordeal of a man alone, stripped of certainty, confronted by visions, and delivered back changed. To weigh it fairly, we look at both lenses. The first lens is the UFO narrative. It begins with the figures themselves. Small, stocky, masked, their faces hidden behind metallic helmets. They carried tubes for breathing, wore suits with gleaming joints, and moved with a strength out of proportion to their size. These details match descriptions in other abduction cases from the late 1960s, not only in Brazil, but in scattered reports across Latin America and even Europe. Their craft, too, fits this pattern. A cylindrical vessel with discs at its ends, a bright interior without visible lamps, a control console, and the sensation of ascent that lasted long enough to suggest leaving Earth. The journey itself deepened the case. Joe's described the hum, the tilt, the suffocating helmet, the pain of pressure and cold. He remembered guttural voices, unlike human speech, yet carrying tone and rhythm, almost playful. He reported being shown images, being asked for weapons, and seeing bodies on a slab. The narrative holds together. It has internal logic. His missing days, his reappearance hundreds of miles away, and his limp afterward are consistent with something happening to him, even if the cause is debated. But the weaknesses are clear too. Jose presented no physical evidence. The bodies he described were never confirmed. No fragment of the craft was recovered. His entire story rests on memory under extreme duress, filtered through retellings to interviewers and researchers. Without material proof, the UFO reading leans on trust in his testimony and the coherence of the narrative. The second lens is older than the flying saucer age. It reads his ordeal as a form of shamanic initiation, an encounter shaped by culture and stress. In this view, the forest is the stage. Isolation and fear are the tools. Pain marks the threshold, the beam on his legs, the cramps, the helplessness. He is pulled away from familiar ground, blindfolded, stripped of control, and made to drink a bitter liquid that changes his state of mind. Then comes the vision, a road guide, calm, serene, offering peace when fear should dominate. This is not a detail unique to Jose. Across cultures, those in moments of crisis, whether through ritual, illness, or accident, describe visions of figures who guide, teach, or reassure. The symbolic exchange reinforces this reading. His rosary, the object of faith he clung to, is taken, passed around, studied. It becomes part of the trial. In traditional rites, sacred objects are often tested, removed, or transformed before being returned to the initiate. Jose's prayers, his refusal to give weapons, his stance of faith, these are his responses to the trial. He emerges shaken but unbroken. Seen this way, the elements fall into a pattern: ordeal, teacher, return. The quarry is the place of emergence, foreign and strange. The limp and the weight loss mark his ordeal physically. His reappearance days later, changed and hollow-eyed, recalls countless myths where the initiate disappears, is presumed gone, and returns bearing new knowledge. Yet this lens has its limits. The distance remains. No rite explains how he ended up 225 miles away. The timeline is still strange. 4.5 days unaccounted for. And the technological elements he described, the helmets, the craft, the glowing beam, do not fit cleanly into the symbolic logic of indigenous rites. Unless we assume his imagination cloaked a cultural pattern in modern imagery, those details remain stubborn. Both lenses, then, explain part of the story and leave part untouched. We should be careful here. Memory under fear is never neutral. What someone sees in such a state is shaped by what they believe, what they fear, and what their culture offers as symbols. For a Catholic soldier in Brazil in 1969, a robed man bringing peace would feel divine. For a man raised on stories of modern sightings, stocky figures in metallic suits might feel just as real. Neither cancels the other. Both show how experience bends into forms that make sense at the time. What makes Jose's account powerful is not that it can be proved in a lab. It's that it holds both readings in tension. As an abduction, it has detail and coherence but lacks proof. As a rite of passage, it has symbolism and cultural echoes, but fails to explain the hard geography of his return. Neither lens fully explains him. Both point to the same truth. Something happened that left him thinner, weaker, and forever marked. And perhaps that's why his story has lasted. Not because it solves the question of aliens or spirits, but because it shows how fragile the line is between the two. A soldier stood his ground and said no to a request he should never have received. Whether you read his ordeal as an encounter with beings from elsewhere or as a trial shaped by faith and fear, the facts still leave gaps no one has closed. He left for a fishing trip and came back days later, miles away, limping, sunburnt, and changed. That much is certain. So what do you see? A craft, a rite, or something stranger still? If you've stayed with us this far, drop the words, "No way, Sol Dair," in the comments so we'll know you made it to the end. Next time, we'll open another military file, one where the gear readings went off the charts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming. Share this with someone who loves a mystery.